Some people don't post, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're saying it somewhere else, to a friend on a walk, to a page that doesn't keep score, to a life that doesn't ask for proof. In a culture that equates visibility with value, their silence is misread as absence. Yet off-screen a different logic runs, one that prioritizes context over spectacle, attention over applause, and depth over display. The assumption that non-posters are simply shy collapses on contact with reality. Many of them host the dinner, lead the meeting, debate the hard thing in private, then decline to flatten that moment into content. The assumption that they're behind mistakes not posting for not knowing, when in fact many are fluent power users of the internet, heavy readers, precise searchers, skilled organizers of information, who draw a line between using networks and performing on them. The assumption that their silence is judgment turns inward projection into a story about others, when what's usually happening is boundary setting, a deliberate choice about what belongs to the crowd and what belongs to the circle. Psychologically, posting is a medium, not a motive. People seek expression, belonging, status, creativity, and contribution, whether or not they have a public feed, and non-posters route these motives through different channels. A private group, a three-person text thread, a kitchen table, a journal with no algorithm. The channel matters because it shapes the cost of speech. Expectations shift, the signal-to-noise ratio changes, the feedback loop speeds up or slows down, and the risk of being flattened or misunderstood expands or contracts. One major driver of opting out is context collapse, the way platforms merge audiences that in real life stay separate. Co-workers, cousins, clients, classmates, future employers, and random strangers all watching the same sentence. So a post becomes a performance for every room at once. If you're sensitive to nuance, or if your work carries reputational weight or confidentiality, context collapse feels like walking a tightrope over a crowd primed to screenshot. Not posting, then, can be a form of self-protection that preserves complexity by keeping conversations within contexts where nuance breathes. Add to this the economics of attention. Feeds are built to harvest arousal, outrage, envy, performative empathy, and some temperaments simply refuse to lease their nervous systems to those incentives. High sensitivity, introversion, conscientiousness, and even a well-trained sense of professional duty. Therapists, teachers, executives, lawyers, researchers can all bias a person towards slower channels where stakes are clear and audiences are specific. There's also audience capture, the way creators slowly become servants to the expectations of the crowd they attracted, which non-posters avoid by never entering the contract, and the paradox of posting about private life. The moment you show something tender, you inherit the job of maintaining a narrative about it. Some people would rather live the intimacy than manage the storyline of it. Others avoid the treadmill of self-comparison, knowing that even with media literacy, repeated exposure to curated lives nudges the psyche toward invisible grading. Not posting, for them, is like switching the phone to airplane mode, so attention can thicken around what's present. A practice less about withdrawal than about stewardship. It's easy to mock that stance as precious, yet notice how often great conversations happen when no one is taking notes. Laughter loosens, stories lengthen, risk becomes possible. Non-posting protects that texture. It also protects privacy's creative function. Incubation. Ideas need darkness before daylight, and work in progress withers under constant preview. The non-poster often shares late. After the book is drafted, the garden has grown, the trip is lived, because they prefer to be altered by the experience rather than by the metrics attached to the experience. You can call that secrecy. They call it sovereignty. Importantly, non-posting is not anti-social, but pro-social in a different register. They respond in DMs, send voice notes, set up dinners, mail articles with a handwritten margin, show up at funerals, remember birthdays without posting proof. They belong through reliability, not virality. In this frame, silent people are often deeply communicative, just not for the panopticon. And while the feed trains us to equate generosity with public performance, a quieter ethic persists. Take care of your side of the street, keep confidences, repair ruptures directly, let your relationships be the footprint. If you zoom out, the pattern coheres. Choosing not to post is a strategic alignment of medium and motive in order to minimize distortion. It lowers the chance that a joke to friends becomes a scandal to strangers, that a vulnerable reflection becomes a weapon in the hands of people who don't wish you well, that a heartfelt update becomes one more tile in an identity mosaic you never agreed to curate. It's also a refusal of constant self-narration, the exhausting job of being both protagonist and publicist of your life. So the psyche can rest from self-surveillance. That rest isn't laziness, it's psychological hygiene. And in the long run, it supports sturdier forms of expression. Art that's made for meaning rather than metrics. Conversations that can hold contradiction. Commitments that aren't shaped by the dopamine loop. Silence in this sense is not emptiness, but editorial choice, not hiding, but honoring the context that gives words their shape. So the next time you wonder why someone never posts, consider that you might be looking at a different theory of value, one that trusts quiet labor, prizes unphotographed joy, and treats attention as a resource to be budgeted, not a river to be dammed and sold. They are not missing from the world. They're simply present where the camera can't see. For many non-posters, the roots of their choice trace back to temperament, risk calculus, and role responsibility, rather than a simple aversion to technology, and understanding that layered mix explains why their silence endures, even when platforms become friendlier or trends shift. Temperamentally, traits like introversion, sensory sensitivity, or high conscientiousness bias a person toward channels where feedback is slower, audiences are known, and signals are less amplified. DMs, small group chats, in-person tables, because those spaces preserve nuance and reduce the physiological cost of attention switching. Add to that an internalized ethic, often formed in families where privacy was either prized or necessary, that you do not turn living relationships into public theater, and you get a coherent value system in which not posting is less a negation and more a positive commitment to intimacy, depth, and continuity. The risk calculus deepens the stance. Reputational risk for professionals whose words travel differently, therapists, teachers, clinicians, lawyers, executives, soldiers, is non-trivial, and the specter of context collapse means that a sentence tailored for colleagues might be read by a rival, a teenager, or a tabloid aggregator, each importing incompatible norms. Even for those without sensitive jobs, algorithmic memory, where a throwaway thought becomes a permanent tile in a searchable mosaic, invites caution because humans grow, and the pace of public revision is rarely generous. There are also real safety concerns, people navigating harassment, stalking, or domestic instability. Calibrate visibility like a pilot trims a plane, minute to minute, because a location tag or a visible pattern can map to risk. Similarly, members of marginalized groups often carry additional layers of surveillance awareness, both institutional and social, that make the innocent post feel less like a harmless share and more like optional exposure to misinterpretation or hostility. These concerns don't mean non-posters dislike community, often the opposite. They are keenly aware that communities with teeth, neighbors who bring soup, friends who will move a couch, are built through reciprocal labor more than public declarations. The lab for that labor is offline, showing up, remembering, forgiving, arguing in private so the relationship can grow rather than perform. Still, many non-posters are not absolutists. They may maintain latent accounts, watch from the edges, or post rarely with deliberate delay. After the trip rather than during, after the project launches rather than while fragile, because incubation protects creativity from premature feedback and the self from audience capture. That slow slide where you begin creating to keep the crowd rather than to keep the truth. This incubation impulse is not preciousness, but craft wisdom shared by writers, researchers, artists, and entrepreneurs. Early exposure invites external constraints that can calcify an idea before it has legs. Cultural context also matters. In some places, a tight honor culture and dense kin networks mean that offline reputation carries the same social capital that posting tries to simulate elsewhere. In other places, religious or communal norms make humility, avoiding self-display, a live moral value. Generational stories shape the mix too. Older cohorts who tasted the web's pre-platform openness often see the current attention market as narrower and more extractive, while younger people raised on feeds sometimes toggle into a quiet counterculture after burning out on perpetual performance or witnessing how quickly classmates' missteps become collective sport. Then there's the cognitive load argument. The modern attention stack, notifications, reels, group chats, comments, can make a person feel as if their mind belongs to the crowd, and non-posting becomes a form of bandwidth budgeting, a way to keep mental RAM for tasks that reward depth. Craft, care, study, long walks that return with big thoughts. They do not condemn posting outright. They may even appreciate and support creators who do it well. But they reserve their own output for venues where feedback is reasonably proportionate to effort and where the incentives line up with their values. Beneath all of this is a different stance toward identity work. If posting is a steady act of self-narration, curating the protagonist's arc in public, non-posters often prefer identity to be negotiated iteratively within relationships and tested in actual consequences rather than likes. They are wary of how swiftly a public brand can harden around a few repeated moves and then subtly police future choices. If people expect the funny take, you'll keep giving the funny take long after you're ready to be serious. By keeping their theatre small, they preserve the right to pivot quietly. Some hold a philosophical posture, epistemic humility, that resists the pressure to weigh in quickly on everything. I don't yet know enough to say, my opinion is not required. Or, the best contribution now is listening. This restraint looks like indifference in a culture of compulsive commentary, but it is often care. A refusal to add noise, to wound with hot takes, or to center oneself in every storm. Others hold a trauma-informed boundary that recognizes posting as a form of vulnerability without control, and choose to reserve vulnerability for spaces where repair is possible. And then there's plain preference, the love of being unrecorded, the freedom of an evening that leaves no trace but a fuller heart, the joy of a hike that exists only between feet and dirt. Critics might argue that public silence is civic silence, and that platforms are now the square, but many non-posters contribute civically through local action. School boards, mutual aid, mentoring, precisely because those arenas reward reliability more than rhetoric. They are not escaping accountability. They're choosing an arena where accountability looks like eyes you will see again. Even in professional settings that reward visibility, some will post by proxy, publishing peer-reviewed work, presenting at conferences, writing long-form newsletters with slow cadence, or letting institutions announce outcomes while they keep commentary minimal. In every case, the pattern is the same: a line medium with motive to minimize distortion and maximize integrity. And when FOMO howls, many cultivate JOMO, the joy of missing out, as a countermuscle, remembering that attention is a finite life resource and that being fully present in one small room often enlarges the world more than being diffusely present in a million. None of this makes posting wrong. It simply makes non-posting legible, a sane, situational, and often ethical response to the structure of modern media. Seen clearly, the quiet ones are not ghosts at the feast, but cooks in the kitchen, friends on the porch, mentors after hours. The kind of people whose influence compounds quietly because it's rooted in trust, not reach, and whose days, unscored by counters, leave room for the long projects and the long friendships that metrics can't quite measure. For a deeper lens, think of non-posting through three overlapping frameworks: attachment, motivation, and identity construction, each reframing silence as strategy rather than deficit. Attachment first, people who reliably satisfy their belonging needs offline don't require constant digital reassurance, and the secure base of real friends, family rituals, or craft communities reduces the impulse to broadcast for ambient validation. Even those with avoidance streaks may skip posting not from coldness, but from a protective reflex against context collapse, preferring intimacy where repair is possible to spectacle where misunderstandings metastasize. Anxious-leaning folks sometimes abstain for the opposite reason, because feeds spike hypervigilance, comparison, and feedback chasing, and they discover that removing the slot machine quiets their nervous system enough to feel the world directly. Now motivation, self-determination. Theory says humans thrive on autonomy. competence, and relatedness, and many non-posters pursue all three elsewhere. Autonomy in choosing when and how to be seen, competence in deep work that isn't optimized for virality, relatedness in smaller circles where reciprocity outpaces performance. Public feeds can compromise these pillars. Autonomy shrinks under algorithmic nudges. Competence bends toward novelty over mastery. Relatedness gets replaced by parasocial drift. So the non-poster optimizes the environment rather than sheer willpower, designing their attention diet the way an athlete designs training cycles. Low junk, high fiber, long slow distance of reading and making. Occasional sprints of public communication when the moment fits. Now identity, online identity work invites continuous self-narration under surveillance, which can harden into what sociologists call audience capture, the slow drift from making to keep integrity into making to keep a crowd. Non-posters hedge that risk by keeping their possible selves in play, trying new roles privately without the gravity of brand continuity. They understand that transformation requires a season of being misfit to your old story, and that season is fragile under mass commentary. This is especially acute for people changing careers, deconstructing beliefs, or healing trauma because performative vulnerability often outpaces genuine integration and then boomerangs as shame. Abstaining is not refusal of truth, but pacing of disclosure until the inner work and outer naming can match. Consider also the cognitive ecology. Feeds compress time, everything now, flatten expertise, everyone equal until the dog pile, and accelerate moral emotions, outrage is cheap, which lowers the payoff of thoughtful contribution. Non-posters often prefer slow venues, long-form essays, salons, supper clubs, not because they fear debate, but because those formats preserve nuance and consequence. Even their news intake tends toward analysis over churn, because they've noticed that high-frequency updates degrade understanding, while weekly or monthly syntheses improve it. Emotionally, non-posters aren't immune to FOMO, but they practice counterweights. JOMO, joy of missing out, ROMO, relief of missing out, and SOMO, savoring of missing out, distinct moves that reframe absence as agency. They'll set rules like no posting during thresholds, births, deaths, romances beginning or ending, early-stage projects, using liminal times for attention consolidation rather than distribution. They'll practice temporal distance, share after the season has closed, because perspective is a quality of time, not intensity. And they develop private economies of meaning, a text thread with 3 friends, a monthly letter, a shared folder of voice notes, Sunday walks that function as an organism of conversation, spaces where the reward is depth, not reach. Critics might ask, but isn't public speech a civic duty? And non-posters answer by changing the level of analysis. Civic life is multi-scalar. You can serve locally, coaching, canvassing, tutoring, mutual aid, and structurally, policy work, research, without maintaining a public persona. Indeed, some roles demand low profile to be effective. The assumption that the square is purely digital confuses a platform with the polys. Another critique: silence enables harm. Sometimes, yes, complicity can hide behind quiet, but many non-posters apply a 2-part test, competence and consequence, before speaking. Am I close enough to know and close enough to help? If yes, they act where leverage is real, inside teams, institutions, neighborhoods, rather than perform where leverage is simulated, viral threads that collapse into heat without heat's responsibility. And when they do speak publicly, they do so with a bias toward primary sources, slow claims, and specific asks, refusing the adrenaline economy that rewards certainty over care. Professionally, some adopt portfolio visibility rather than personality visibility. Let the paper, product, class, or clinic outcomes stand. Publish under institutional banners. Write under your own name, but keep cadence deliberate. Track impact privately. Trust that people who need your work will find it through channels that honor context. This is not naivete about attention markets, but a bet on compounding integrity. Psychologically, the gains are palpable. Fewer identity whiplashes, steadier focus, cleaner boundaries, and a capacity to receive real feedback from trusted peers rather than applause from strangers. It also preserves awe. The unposted sunset is not more real, but it is less interrupted, and the uncaptioned grief is not more pure, but it is less performatively steered. These qualitative differences accumulate, and the person who habits them tends to report richer felt presence, better sleep, and friendships that survive friction because they aren't tethered to public theatre. Non-posting is also a strategy for ambiguity tolerance. By refusing to narrate everything, you practice letting experiences be long enough to teach you. Premature sharing often forecloses interpretation, like naming a painting too early. In creative work, this is the difference between drafting under the spell of your material and drafting under the gaze of imagined commenters. The former invites discovery, the latter demands defense. Finally, non-posters aren't monolithic. They rotate through modes. The archivist, who posts rarely but meticulously, once a quarter a thoughtful roundup. The relationalist, who lives in private threads and shows up in person. The maker, who keeps a low profile while shipping high-claim outputs. The seasonal public, who surfaces during launches or crises and then recedes. The selective loud, who advocates fiercely on a few topics and ignores the rest. Each is a harmonic, not a virtue hierarchy, and each reveals the same principle: align medium with motive, cost with capacity, and speech with stewardship. When that alignment is honored, silence stops looking like a hole to be filled and starts reading as a contour that gives shape to a life. In day-to-day practice, the non-poster's life is stitched together by small, repeatable choices that keep experience primary and documentation optional. Phones face down at meals, notifications pruned to the bone, camera roll used like a notebook rather than a billboard, conversations that end without "let's get a photo," and rituals that are felt rather than filmed. These aren't acts of superiority, but of scope control, decisions that keep the nervous system's limited attentional budget aligned with what they care about most. So their calendar tilts toward deep work blocks, long walks, standing coffees, standing calls, volunteer commitments that involve hands, and recurring dinners that turn acquaintances into kin. When relationships matter across distance, they cultivate intentional private channels that don't require performance. Small group threads where everyone has permission to disappear and return. Voice notes that carry tone and breath. Letters and postcards because slowness is part of the gift. Office hours for friends during heavy seasons. And travel planned around people rather than content opportunities. The etiquette is simple and sturdy. Ask before sharing someone else's moment. Omit the details that aren't yours to tell. Avoid triangulating public praise into private pressure, and resolve friction by call or in person so that apologies arrive with full bandwidth. Professionally, they compress public-facing to what the work itself requires. CVs updated, portfolios current, bios accurate. But they avoid turning the work into an identity broadcast. Many adopt publish the artifact, not the life. Ship the paper, the feature, the data set, the classroom result, the non-profit's impact report. Then step back and let the object carry the public story while the person keeps living the private one. If visibility is strategic, freelancers, founders, activists, they treat it like any other tool, scoped, scheduled, and bounded by purpose. Launch windows with clear start-stop, Q&A in moderated venues, a cadence that matches recovery time, and a refusal to let the metrics metabolize their self-worth. They keep a why doc for themselves, a one-page reminder of the specific reasons they will and won't post, so that during adrenaline spikes, criticism, virality, loneliness, they can choose rather than react. Their phones often run on low-stimulation defaults, grayscale to dampen novelty, home screens with only essentials, widgets that surface calendars or reading instead of feeds, do not disturb blocks tied to sleep and focus, because they've learned that design beats discipline. When the world erupts and everyone is urged to say something now, they consult three gates: truth, usefulness, stewardship. Do I know enough to be accurate? Am I close enough to help? And can I care for the consequences of speaking here? Which does not produce silence so much as it reallocates voice to contexts with leverage. Talking to a neighbor who votes, emailing a representative with a policy ask, donating, showing up. Non-posters also practice the ethics of witnessing without display. Attend the march, bring water, listen to the speaker, go home without a selfie. Visit the bereaved, wash dishes, hold the silence. Show up for a child's recital with both eyes. Then let the applause be the record. Because they do not outsource memory to the timeline, they build private archives, journals, shared family albums with tight permissions, printed photos, annotated reading logs, yearly letters to future selves, and these archives, paradoxically, deepen intimacy because they are curated for the few who were there or who will truly care later, not for the ambient audience whose attention is broad but shallow. When friends live primarily online, non-posters negotiate the boundary with kindness rather than contempt. I love seeing your updates. I won't always post mine, but I'll reply to yours. I'm happy to be in your story if we check with everyone first. I'll send you the photos directly. And they protect the relationship from becoming a content barter. When collaboration involves someone whose livelihood depends on posting, artists, journalists, influencers, the non-poster clarifies consent gradients ahead of time. Green light for behind-the-scenes hands and objects, yellow for faces with delay, red for kids and locational specifics, and they respect reciprocal lines. Kids are a special case. Many non-posters adopt a child's rights frame, future autonomy over present cuteness, so they favor wide shots, back-of-head angles, initials instead of names, anecdotes without identifying details, and a general principle that a child's dignity outranks an adult's engagement goals. In communities, the quiet person often becomes a connection node, precisely because their attention is not fragmented. They remember who needs what, which birthday is approaching, which grant deadline fits, who should meet whom. Their influence compounds through reliability. Who shows up to set chairs, who drives late, who knows the neighbors' names. Forms of leadership that are invisible to metrics but decisive in crises. During career transitions, non-posters lean on reference webs rather than audience size. Mentors, former managers, colleagues whose direct knowledge carries weight, and they invest in craft signals, certifications, samples, pilots that travel well without personal broadcasting. They are not allergic to publicity. They are specific. Interviews with aligned outlets, opt-in newsletters with sane cadence, conference talks with Q&A, workshops where questions shape the room. Even there, they design for exit, limited series rather than endless feeds, to resist the inertia that turns a project into a persona. On the mental health front, their stance functions like proactive relapse prevention against comparison spirals and outrage binges. They keep mood ledgers that correlate feed exposure with sleep, irritability, and focus. And they adjust inputs like an athlete tuning recovery. They practice threshold hygiene. Don't scroll upon waking or before sleep. Don't post while grieving, infatuated, or enraged. Don't read comments when the body is already flooded. And when lapses happen, they will. Repair is gentle. Close the tab, go outside, call someone, do one helpful task. Spiritually, religious or secular, they guard sanctuaries where no data is extracted. A weekly hour with the phone off, a hike, a pew, a mat, a studio, a kitchen. Rooms where value is not calculated by witnesses. Importantly, non-posting is not a fixed identity, but a moving strategy across seasons. The same person may go public during a campaign and go quiet to rebuild, may keep family life private but open source their lab protocols, may share art and guard romance. Flexibility is the point. The through line is stewardship, matching message, medium, moment, and metabolic cost. And because silence can be misread as disconnection, they counterbalance with deliberate presence signals. Quick thinking of you notes, timely congratulations, small gifts, RSVP honesty, showing face when it counts, so relationships feel held even without the ambient drip of posts. They also practice consent to be unreachable, especially with work teams. Shared calendars, escalation protocols, and clear expectations about response times, so that not living in the feed doesn't translate into dropped balls. In families, they narrate the why to teens. We don't post everything because we protect what matters. We ask before sharing because people aren't content. We don't dunk on strangers because that trains our heart toward contempt. And give teens agency with guardrails, private accounts, delayed posting, friend audits, digital Sabbaths they co-design. Finally, non-posters bring a particular gift to a culture of constant narration. They preserve the right to be changed by experiences before announcing them, which keeps growth organic. They protect the dignity of other people's stories by refusing to turn every encounter into a take, which keeps relationships humane. And they remind the rest of us that a day can be whole without proof, a love can be real without witnesses, and a life can be generous without a feed. Taken together, these practices do not reject modernity. They rebalance it, proving that participation and privacy need not be enemies, and that attention, when treated as a sacred commons rather than a commodity, becomes fertile soil for the kinds of meaning that cannot be tallied but can certainly be lived. In the end, the psychology of people who don't post on social media is less a riddle about silence and more a lesson in fit. Fit between motive and medium, values and velocity, intimacy and audience. It is an ethic of stewardship in a time that confuses being seen with being known. A wager that meaning compounds better in contexts sized to care, and a quiet refusal to let identity be reverse-engineered by metrics. You could caricature this as prudishness or fear, but look closely at the texture of a non-poster's days, and you'll find presence doing its slow work. Letters answered, meals cooked, research refined, neighbors greeted, grief borne without staging, joy received without the background hum of performance. You'll find a different attention economy in which bandwidth is budgeted toward what remains after the scroll, craft, kin, health, place, and where memory is entrusted to people and paper because those forms age with you instead of siphoning you into a spectacle. You'll notice, too, how their restraint is not a universal no but 1,000 specific yeses. Yes to private archives over ambient audiences. Yes to deliberate cadence over perpetual commentary. Yes to speaking where leverage is real and repair is possible. Yes to protecting the dignity of experiences, romance, birth, loss, conflict, until naming them clarifies rather than distorts. And if you press further, why opt out when platforms are the square? The answer returns to scale and stewardship. Civic life is multi-layered, and non-posters often favor the rings where accountability is thick and consequences are shared. School boards, clinics, labs, mutual aid, tutoring, mentoring. Arenas that reward reliability over rhetoric. None of this makes posting suspect. It makes universal posting unnecessary. Some seasons demand a voice, some roles benefit from a platform, some messages bloom in daylight, and the non-poster's wisdom is to treat visibility like a tool rather than a habitat. Pick it up with purpose, put it down before it colonizes your hours, let the work and the relationships remain the point. If you recognize yourself in this portrait, if you have felt the fatigue of context collapse or the whiplash of audience capture, if you have watched a half-formed thought harden into a public tile and wished for the grace of revision, consider this permission to choose a smaller theater and a truer script. Begin with practical regressions that are really progress. Prune notifications. Right-size your rooms. Move more conversations to spaces where tone and repair exist. Write your why I post, why I don't, one-pager and return to it when adrenaline spikes. Build private rituals that mark time without witnesses. If you're a poster who loves the craft and community of public work, consider this a nudge toward kinder ergonomics. Guard incubation. Refuse the pace that flattens nuance. Let your audience be a partner, not a boss, and remember that the truth you protect in the drafting room will serve the people you aim to help better than the hot take you launch from exhaustion. If you love someone who rarely posts, receive their silence as a form of respect, not a withdrawal. Ask directly for what you need, share clearly what's okay to share, and trust that attention given in the room is heavier than proof given to the crowd. And if you lead teams or families, name the culture you want. We protect what matters. We ask before sharing. We speak where we can help. We practice repair, because words repeated become the metronome hearts learn to keep. Most importantly, remember that this is not a referendum on modernity, but a recovery of agency within it. We are allowed to cultivate gardens within the city, to keep sanctuaries inside the signal, to choose the cadence at which our lives become language. So let this be the closing beat and the invitation. Your value is not pegged to your visibility. Your worth is not an index of impressions. Your best work may require seasons of being unwatchable, and your closest bonds may deepen precisely because they were spared the pressure to perform. Whether you post daily or once a year or never at all, align your medium with your motive, your exposure with your capacity, your voice with your stewardship. Treat attention like a sacred commons, yours, others, everyone's, and spend it where it returns as wisdom rather than residue. The algorithm will not notice your restraint, but your nervous system will, your craft will, your people will. And someday, when a life event arrives that does not belong to the feed, a threshold too holy or too heavy for the square, you will be practiced in the older, sturdier arts, showing up without a camera, listening without preparing a caption, speaking when you are close enough to help, resting when you are not. That is the quiet thesis of the non-poster and the closing benediction here. We do not owe the world our constant narration. We owe one another our considered presence. May your silence, when you choose it, be generous. May your speech, when you offer it, be accurate and kind. And may your days, tallied not in likes but in lives touched, become proof enough that attention, rightly stewarded, is still one of the sweetest ways to love.